everybody. We have 4 people here today, and we're going to be talking about the rise and fall of Mars Hill and our various reactions to it. So there's a whole lot to talk about. There's a whole lot of material. It's an extremely popular podcast at the moment, like not even just in the Christian world. Like I've had non-Christian friends be like, hey, do you know anything about like this Mars Hill church? I'm like, oh man, don't get me started, please. But what do you want to know? So it's like in like the top 5 podcasts in the world or something at the moment.
Yeah.
It's the first interesting thing Christianity Today has done in at least a decade. There's a lot to talk about. But anyway, we should probably go around and do some introductions about why we care and what our connection is. And I guess I'll go first because I actually probably have the shortest one of those. Is I guess I've never been to a Mars Hill church, but I did grow up kind of half in, half out of larger American megachurchdom. I met my wife in a Bible study of a megachurch that, in a lot of ways was not that different from a Mars Hill church. A little different in some ways, in some important ways, but also not that different. And I'm not sure if I'd never read a full Mark Driscoll book, but I'd probably heard at least a few sermons or something like that of his prior to his career kind of going off the rails and stuff like that. But I guess I'm just a curious, concerned, barely outside observer of the whole thing. So I'll pass it over to Trip next.
All right. So Trip, I moved out to Seattle in 2008, and so I started. Some of my college friends that I knew from Campus Crusade were going to Mars Hill. And so I just kind of joined them in their small group, and then attended the church then all the way up until it fell. I taught a small group there, and I was kind of in process of becoming a deacon, kind of overseeing several small groups and making sure that like things were working well and that kind of thing. So I was kind of like there for the end of it. I would say like the last, third of Mars Hill is what I saw when it was huge, multi-site, multi-state, gigantic church, until it like collapsed kind of overnight. So I'm interested in it because I think the podcast has some important things to say, but then also has some things that I think that we should push back on as well a little bit. So that's why I'm interested in this. So Sarah?
Yeah, I'd say I'm more of an outside observer, but a lot of the dynamics that have been discussed in the podcast, I've experienced in different ways throughout my past church history. So it covers a lot of the questions and controversies and difficulties that I've had in my own experience that I'm not to the bottom of them. I haven't figured them out, obviously. So that's part of this discussion here today too.
I'm here because I'm interested in everything, and I want to do all the chats. But so the bulk of my adult life, though, I was involved in primarily a couple Sovereign Grace churches, Sovereign Grace ministries, which they bring up Sovereign Grace in there. C.J. Mahaney and Joshua Harris were probably the biggest names in the Sovereign Grace world, and relationally and theologically, they're pretty much identical to Mars Hill, except they weren't in Seattle and they didn't have Driscoll, but they did all the same kinds of stuff. They made all their own music. They had a big music ministry. I used to listen to all the Mars Hill music. I used to listen to Driscoll stuff. When they mentioned conferences, like when they mentioned that conference with Tim Keller, like that conference with Tim Keller and Driscoll and Pipe, I was there. I was at that conference in Minneapolis. So I ran in a lot of those circles. And just as I was listening through the podcast, I guess I would say is there there are so many patterns and spiritual, there are these different spiritual phenomenons that I think are articulated throughout the Mars Hill podcast that I experience, that I think are symptomatic of a much deeper thing, which is part of my whole intellectual project. So that's kind of why I'm here.
Yeah. So I guess my first question to whoever wants to answer this is, why do you think the podcast is so popular? Like, why are people listening to a, long form, multi-hour story about a church? That isn't exactly the thing that you would expect to be, number 3 or 4 or whatever it is on the Apple podcast list. Why do you think this is so popular?
Well, part of it's failure porn, right? I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah.
Part of it is, I think, because Driscoll was such a huge personality, and I mean, there's just the same reasons that he was so charismatic and drew so many people in. I mean, that just amplifies the like failure porn side of it, like the fact that he went down, and the people that just want that. So many people are jaded by, I think, Christianity too, hence the whole deconstruction thing, that they hear all this and it's just instant kind of fodder for self-justification for probably legitimate hurts that have happened in their own lives. And so plus it's this big consumeristic machine. I mean, it's very America, the whole thing. I mean, that's kind of I don't know how.
Yeah, I mean, we should say it's well done. Like, it's a well-produced podcast. This isn't like an amateur thing. So I think that's part of it. I agree. The failure porn, like, there's a reason that we all like. It's the reason, like, the number one news story when Tiger Woods had that car wreck was Tiger Woods and his fall from grace and that kind of stuff. So, like, we like that story of this big successful guy, like, kind of falling from grace. So I think that we like that kind of story anyway. But then, yeah, I think it also hits on the way that Mars Hill and what the podcast is bringing forward. It hits on a lot of our cultural debate right now about women and abuse and power and that kind of stuff. And so it's hitting on like a nerve that we're still working through as a culture. So I think all those things conspire to make it just like a perfect storm for a podcast like this to shoot up the charts.
Yep.
Yeah, and just that everyone pretty much in the US has had some sort of experience in or with a church. So the fact that it's widely appealing doesn't really surprise me. It actually reminds me a lot of, there's a podcast I listened to last year called The Dream that is set up very similarly, but it covers multi-level marketing. And I think the appeal of that is a lot of people who listen to it either had been involved in some sort of multi-level marketing and gotten burned, or else they are just really annoyed by it. So, I mean, I think a lot of the same dynamics of the attraction of that podcast relate to this one too, because, some part of the story you'll recognize in your own experience, I think, if you've had any church experience at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it touches on, there's a lot of archetypal stuff going on. Right. And like Luke said, the story is just so American in so many different ways that I feel like it just captures, there's just so many different angles that it's almost hard to know what I want to talk about it. And then I'm sure the podcast itself is figuring out, like, what do we even want to talk about? But I also get the impression, and you could hear this sort of in the introduction to the last few episodes, that it seems like they're getting a lot of feedback and are trying to respond to the feedback, but not quite sure how. And I think one of the things that I feel like I can't help but notice in this is that there is this weird, there's like a brewing civil war within evangelicalism that I feel like is creeping up. And this podcast is also clearly one side against one of the other sides of that civil war. And it's hard for them to know, are they trying to bridge both divides and have kind of both the pro and the con side get their say, or are they taking a stance clearly on one side and announcing that that's what they're doing? And I think that that's part of the conflict that's brewing in between the editorial decisions all over the podcast.
Yeah, I think that Cosper, I think especially early, well, I think the early podcasts I thought were really good. Episode 5 I thought was pretty terrible in a lot of ways, and I thought that was taking a side. I do think that he got some feedback. That's the things that we do to women episode. That's the Joshua Harris like complementarian egalitarian thing. Okay. I thought that one was extremely one-sided, and I didn't understand why. I think that he got some feedback, and to his credit, like some later episodes, he brought in some other people to talk about it in a slightly different way. So I think he's trying to respond, but I mean, that episode kind of told me what I needed to know about like, yeah, this is you have an angle and you're going with it. And I think you're right. We are also, I mean, you see this in like the Southern Baptist Convention, some of the infighting on who's going to be president and what stances are they going to take, like the Nashville statements and various things on marriage equality and women's roles in the church and various things. I think that this podcast is hitting on all of that it's hitting on that nerve and in a really profound way.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like to describe what I feel like the Civil War is briefly, that hasn't really started yet, but I think everyone knows that maybe Fort Sumter's already happened, and the sides are polarizing pretty quick. It's something, and this is another reason why it's so kind of weird and rich that Christianity Today is hosting this podcast, because, well, like a little bit of background on Christianity Today. Christianity Today is basically the publishing arm of the Billy Graham movement that is still around, right? It's in Wheaton, Illinois, right next to Wheaton College, right? Mm-hmm. Which right next to the Billy Graham Center. And Willow Creek is just, up the road, which is sort of like the archetypal founder of American suburban megachurches that started in Chicago, right? And it's like, Christianity Today was so immersed in that world that was its like audience, that was its history. But now that world is splitting, and like, I don't know how to say this any more briefly than it's really splitting more or less along Trump lines. Is that the same way that the American suburbs sort of flipped from lightly red to lightly blue in the 2016 and 2020 elections? Well, that's having an effect on the politics inside church. And there's basically like a light blue and a red side of American megachurches. And there are all sorts of questions that polarize along that, like egalitarian gender roles, complementarian gender roles, women in church office, no women in church office, slightly friendlier stance on LGBT questions, not a friendly stance, critical race theory, kind of, no critical race theory, right? Like all of these questions are splitting, and it's just almost perfectly a Trump question, really. At the end
that's
of
a
the
good
day.
point. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm curious, Sarah, like, obviously there's some things that you said that you've experienced in your past, and everyone, like, you hear my take on the complementarian thing. I rambled about that for an hour with Paul Vanderklay, so I don't need to say anything else. But I'm curious your take on it, given your experience, and what was your experience, and why did this resonate with you, and what are you still working through?
And we need to elevate female voices, so.
Or do we? Is that the question?
Should we keep them quiet? It's just such a mixed bag. I feel like there's so many areas that are still fuzzy for me. We're still in the midst of not knowing where we belong as far as church goes, not feeling at home anywhere yet, even though we're moving towards orthodoxy. We're still in an evangelical church, still in leadership. And haven't left yet. My husband's still an elder. I lead the music for the most part, so we're pretty embedded. And it hasn't been an easy out, and yet we feel like we can't stay, probably because of how we've experienced. In a lot of ways, it's the authoritarian and church hierarchy stuff. So I'd say that's probably my biggest interest in all of this. The whole complementarian egalitarian issue has not really been that much of an issue in our church experiences. It was when I was growing up, we were in a very charismatic, authoritarian church, but it was actually quite egalitarian. The pastor's wife was also called pastor. She was on the same level. And I think that whole word of faith movement, which was what we stemmed from, tends more egalitarian in a lot of ways. I mean, they have women that are prophets and go around speaking and preaching and all of that. So that wasn't as much the issue. Yeah, again, I'd say it's more the hierarchy and authority and how that is supposed to work itself out in the church. I'm not under the illusions that, you know, the Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church doesn't have problems in its hierarchy. Obviously, that's true.
Not the Catholic Church.
Yeah, not the Catholic Church. But I think it was interesting, Sam. I was looking back a few weeks ago to your 4 P's and how you related them to the different churches. I don't remember which exactly you put where, but the emphasis in the Orthodox Church of right worship, or I think was where you kind of put the Orthodox Church in. And to us, that's kind of why we're leading that way. It's like, well, if the pastor or priest is having a lot of issues and their life is not exactly how it should be, at least your worship is correct, is right, and you can still attend and still receive the sacraments, and it can be okay. As opposed to our experience, and just relating that back to Mars Hill, if the head lead pastor is doing the things they're doing and they have the freedom and ability to take the church in this direction or that direction, it can just pull the whole thing down and drag all the people along with it. So I guess that'd be a starting off point.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because Protestantism in many ways was supposed to try and break free from hierarchy, right? A lot of the Protestant Reformation was, man, this hierarchy is corrupt. Man, they have too much power. We need to give more power to the laity. We need to give more power to the common folk and have more congregational participation in leadership decisions, etc. That was like one of the main points of the Protestant Reformation. But a weird thing that can happen is when you get rid of some structure, is that anarchy can lead to tyranny very quickly. And honestly, one of the things that in this podcast that I found the most bone-chilling story, at least that related to me, was when Driscoll was basically trying to change the bylaws of the church. And there was one of the elders who was a lawyer who was kind of standing in the way, although not like trying to stand in the way. He thought he was just doing his job of like trying to be like, hey guys, this is really important and we have to be very thoughtful and considerate when we change the bylaws, because this is important stuff, right? And Driscoll just steamrolled him and got him basically excommunicated, even though he hadn't done any heresy that I could tell, and I'm pretty good at noticing, and he hadn't done any moral action on those things. And Driscoll was able to use his influence and charisma and whatever to basically have a kangaroo show trial for the guy and get him plowed out of the way so that Driscoll could make the bylaws such that he had more centralized power, right? I thought that was one of the most terrifying things in the whole podcast, and no one, that wasn't picked up on by nearly as many people. But I guess that also kind of relates to my own story and what scares me when churches start doing things. But that was one of those things where it's like, I feel like a lot of times the podcast sometimes over exaggerates Driscoll's faults and tells it from a one-sided story. But that was one of those things where I'm like, I wish they'd gone into that more. And that really made, that was the time that I felt like I most clearly and unambiguously was siding against Driscoll in what he was doing and the stuff that he was up to.
So yeah, well, that's a huge one, because I think I could talk about elder-led churches, particularly in those kind of young, restless, and reform communities. And I think how that plays out practically in creating kind of an implicit culture that even if you don't have a kind of charismatic, authoritarian kind of, and potentially manipulative leader like Driscoll, you'll still get a lot of the same effects just in a really implicit way in those churches. And I've experienced that in a lot of ways in elder-led churches. And one of the because one of the other churches that I've attended besides Sovereign Grace a bunch was I went to Bethlehem for a couple years, and I live in Minneapolis. And so
Is that John Piper's church?
Yep. And so I continue to know people. I mean, he's no longer there really. He's not leading it anymore, but they're currently going through a big break and having a big issue and having infight like this. What's interesting to me is the whole Driscoll phenomenon is it's not an isolated event. Like it's I think symptomatic of a much deeper disease, because these elder-led churches, because really within Protestantism, like that's my understanding, like that's your choice. You have elder-led churches and you have congregationalist churches, which are essentially just democratic. We all vote. It runs like, a democracy. But in the elder-led churches, which whatever, they base off of all these scriptural texts. An interesting aspect to me, and I mean, we don't have to, the most interesting facet from my experience is how kind of these more feminine modes of, because if you don't have a really assertive, hyper masculine leader like Driscoll, I noticed that a lot of the manipulation and repression and stuff works through shame and indirect communication and like fear of, I don't know if this came up much, but gossip was such a big thing. Like you start talking
reputation destruction.
Yeah, you start talking to young, restless, and reformed people who've gone to these kinds of churches about how, just ask any of them about conversations around gossip. It came up a lot. Anytime anyone would have issues about authority and what was happening and decisions would be being made, I guarantee you someone, because it was just like propaganda, almost just implicitly brainwashed into you, that someone would just be like, no, we don't want to be gossipy. We don't want to gossip. We don't want to slander leadership. We don't want to, and it would just.
So that was one of the ways that leadership would exert control over conversation is
and I
by.
Don't even think it was, I don't even think it was conscious.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even think they were trying to do it. When I got together with my book club last week and I was listening to this, I knew this conversation was coming. A lot of these guys have been at Bethlehem, or they currently are at Bethlehem. I have a guy in my book club who teaches at Bethlehem College as an adjunct professor, who like knows Joe Rigney, and like this is Bethlehem's whole issue of what they're going through. And guess what somebody said as we started talking about it? I mean, just guess. Oh, we got to be careful. We don't want to start, I don't want to gossip about this. And, oh, really? I'm surprised that came up. Weird. I don't know. It's just, it's fascinating to me how that happened. And my wife always felt this way, and I did too. Decisions in these elder-led churches, and especially in like an elder-led deacon small group leader model, all of the authority and the control and who leads small groups and everything was always so closely regulated and held closely to the chest. Like it was a very highly curated process, at least in my experience. At least Sovereign Grace was probably more so than Mars Hill, because I went to a Mars Hill church for a while too, and they were a little bit looser with who led small groups. But anytime there was a problem, like you went and talked to the elders. Like it was all, I don't know, it was just, it's almost built in that like any sort of, if something was dysfunctional and there was legit criticism, and you could argue that this is a good thing. It was very, very hard to talk about it. And they were very, I don't know, it created a culture where it felt really wrong to ever say anything against leadership.
Well, and two things to add to that. I think as much as an elder-led or congregational structure is said to be in place, in our experience, it seems like there's still someone who makes the final call. Yeah. And so my husband and I were talking about this a few months back, in how, there's still that person usually that it comes down to. And even if they're saying that the elders are all going to vote and, majority rules, there's there's still such an element of I don't know. It can still cause an issue to an extreme degree if one of the elders says, okay, well, I don't agree with any of these decisions, so I'm leaving. And then they take half the church with them. So
right. Yeah, there's some people that are still whipping the vote that have more influence on what everyone else votes. So even if it's a pure democracy, is it really? Like, we need this guy. If our preacher, the guy who's up in the pulpit every day saying, hey, we really should be doing this, that's going to carry a lot of weight with people, right?
So we were just discussing this, thinking it's a lot easier if we just name the person. Like, let's just call the person who's in charge, and everybody knows, and it's not this weird, trying to figure that out. And then the second thing I've noticed, and I don't remember if you talked about this with Paul or not, but the emphasis on the external, so the emphasis on the appearance, this is something I've experienced too in the churches I've been in, versus the internal and the
Yeah, that was one of the first questions that Paul asked was, what did you find about your Christian life, or looking back and that kind of stuff? And I was like, yeah, it was more activist. It's more external. Like, what are you going to do? What are we going to achieve? Like, all this kind of stuff, and less like the contemplative, and less the participation in just like worshiping and your own spiritual life. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely what Mars Hill did. In retrospect, I didn't really, because they are still giving you an experience, right, in the church with the music and everything. And so they're still giving you some of that. So I think you almost get lulled into thinking that like that part of your life isn't being kind of pushed down, because we still have the small groups, we have all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it definitely kind of lulls you into thinking that you're not being an activist. But that's they were creating activists essentially, which is easy in Seattle, because then we're creating reactionary activists, right? So now you're countercultural, which gets even more attention to the church and that kind of stuff. So it was a good sales technique to be kind of an anti-progressive activist in Seattle, because then you just got a lot more eyeballs.
Yeah, that emphasis on appearance, and so what you just said, Tripp, about that the church was really good at providing a certain kind of emotional, spiritual experience when you were there, right? They put a lot into production. They cared really a whole lot about music, and had really good musicians, and maybe had some sort of stagecraft of, I don't know if they had smoke machines or whatever, but like they put a lot of intentional effort into that. And that sort of spiritual experience that you can get going to a church like that kind of blurs the lines between entertainment and liturgy a little bit. Is it can give you the impression that you're growing spiritually, because you have a deep and profound spiritual experience when you're at the church, but that's not the same thing as spiritual growth and growing in holiness and righteousness and stuff like that.
It's like eating sugar, essentially. Like, you're getting like a little bit of like a sugar high, but it's not healthy for you. It's not going to help you achieve your health goals or anything else like that. But it's eating candy. That's what a lot of it, really, I feel like was.
And that there's, another part of this is like the mixture between like capitalism and church strategy, growth, whatever, is part of this, because it's like a downside. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm gonna go rail against capitalism or something like that, but a downside is like it can Luke would be right there with me, I know, but that like it can prioritize the expedient and the superficial, and there's competition for people to give you the thing that is most superficially and instantaneously gratifying, right? And there isn't as much competition for the long-term benefit, because that is harder to do, and you'll get beat if someone's playing if you're playing a long-term game and someone else is playing a short-term game, they'll beat you in the short term, and they could drive you out of business in the short term. So the long-term game doesn't get to happen because it's undercut.
It's harder to do, it's harder to measure, and the payoff is longer.
Yes.
And so in that you'll get undercut by your competition.
Right.
That way.
And that's why a lot of snacks and stuff are so sugary and what have you, right?
Yep.
You know, they're undercutting each other in a short-term game. And so because there was something so driven about growth and even competing with the other local area churches, right? You know, stealing their congregants and stuff like that.
No, yeah, because I mean, you had a bunch of mainline churches that were kind of like a little bit stale. I mean, they're stale, they're a little bit dying and that kind of stuff. So you have like, you know, maybe it's only 10 or 20 or 30% of those people that don't feel well served. Well, now we have this new exciting, and they're catering to what you're missing here and that kind of stuff. And so you just start sucking all of those people into one church at the expense of all the other churches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think people are getting tired of that? I feel that people are getting really tired of that.
Yes,
I think so.
Is that going to come to an end, or will that type of draw always be part of lives?
I don't know. I'd be interested. I just anecdotally though, I know so many people that are interested. Like you're talking about like maybe going to an Orthodox church, which is kind of like the opposite of that experience in a lot of ways. Like I'm like in Charleston, I'm thinking about going to an Anglican church and trying that out. So I feel like there's a lot of people that are kind of like reacting to like what they're seeing here. I don't know how many. I'd be interested to see if there's anyone that knows any stats on that, but like at least anecdotally, I feel like it.
And I go to a church that is like basically of the same denomination and theology as most of the Willow Church style mega churches, but it's an old small one, right? It's made out of bricks and has a steeple, and you know, unless they did some big construction, it will never fit more than 300 people, right?
Yeah.
And so that's my way of kind of dodging the problem, is by going to an old small version of the thing that I'm kind of familiar with. It certainly has its own problems, but it doesn't have some of those other problems that I'm more scared of than the ones that it does have.
Yeah, well, and even I mean, we'll see with all these movements too, the big movements back to Orthodoxy or Catholicism or Anglicanism or these more the older traditions. We'll see if, and this is what people say, Paul talks about this a lot, we'll see if that's just reactionary.
Right.
Like, is that just the next reactionary?
Yeah.
I don't know. What's hard is back when you were talking about this church, the problem with, I think, the capitalistic model and growth, infinite growth is one of the tenets of technological Babel, by the way, the assumption of infinite growth. But what marketing and propaganda, I mean, are those the same thing? Works really. The problem is when you live in a world that I think is propagandistic to the max, and this is why, like, this is a lot of what Jacques Ellul talks about, is that especially in a technological, so like a technocratic, industrialized, capitalistic world that is also just where propaganda is ubiquitous, and if you think you're not being bought into propaganda, you probably most assuredly are. Like, that's just a recipe for disaster. Like, that's a really, really bad thing, because the phenomenon that you were describing is exactly what will happen. And so unless, I mean, and this gets into the reactionary thing. There may be people that see the problems with all this and reject it and then go to these more ancient traditions. But I guess, you know, as I like to say, you know, that Gillian Welch song, time is the revelator. So like, if you go to an Orthodox church and you stay there your whole life and you're wanting to, and you're doing it in a reactionary way, like, I don't think you're going to stay, because it's not.
And then maybe you stay, but what about your kids that don't have that same experience of having gone through the thing that they need to react against, right?
Very true. And I think that's a common experience for people that grow up, you know, Catholic or Orthodox. They don't have this kind of deconstructing capitalistic, anti-evangelical, ex-evangelical, post-evangelical experience, you know? And so they're just like, oh, this is just the boring, familiar thing that we do all the time. And so then a lot of those, I mean, that's what when all these people came out of, a lot of them came out of Catholicism, you know, they were chasing that kind of feel. Like I want it to feel real. And so I don't know. I don't know how that relates to Mars Hill. I mean, it does, but
yeah, I
Well,
think
more so is kind of like it's a really good symbol of what you're talking about people reacting against, right? Like it's the thing that's driving people to like rethink, I think, a lot of these things, and maybe reactionarily going back to like a more high church, like heavily liturgical tradition, as a way of like, you know, I don't want to be propagandized, so I'm going to go to, you know, the Orthodox Church or something like that. I don't want to be manipulated or whatever.
I mean, that is a way to fight the propaganda and the over, like, back to your Trump point, the overly politicized church culture, whether or not they try to be or not. Like a lot of churches will just be like, we're not going to preach from the politics from the service. Like it's so political. Like it's
Right.
just implicit, you know, it's just there. But like in my church, I was saying this to someone the other day, it's so refreshing. I have no idea the politics of anyone I go to church with, like pretty much no idea.
Mhm.
I assume probably a lot of them are Democrats of some kind. I mean, it's like it's in Minneapolis. Like I'm in Minneapolis proper, but like I have no idea, and it just never comes up because when your liturgy is just like the same thing for 2,000 years, like that's a pretty solid way to fight against propaganda, unless you think you're
Right.
being like religiously indoctrinated or something.
Mhm.
Well,
But
and
if you're
that's been a draw too. It seems that to a certain degree, the people we've met, the churches we've attended, the priests we've had dinner with, there seems to be a level of unity that is able to overcome political divides. And I've experienced it in my real everyday life. I think it, because of the shape of the liturgy, the structure of the church, there is an ability of it to point you all to something, point the people to something higher that is able to unify. Not that those issues don't come up, and still don't divide churches and divide people, but I've not experienced that anywhere else.
So then, yeah, so to that point, I mean, so this has been my experience when I get into like a lot of these conversations that happen. So people will just be like, you know, are you egalitarian or complementarian? Do you believe in elder-led churches or congregationalist churches? Like, what is your thought on, say, like all of these binary questions, which side of the line that you're on? A lot of times I'm just like, I'm like, it's the wrong question. Like, I don't care. I don't care about any of that stuff. Like, you know, like I have opinions on it, but like the whole frame of, and I guess this is probably at my deeper point of the thing that I'm always trying to articulate. The consciousness and the culture that sees all these questions as which side is the right side of history, that attacks all these questions within that spirit, is the wrong spirit.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for Tripp that just came up. First question, when did Mars Hill fall? What year was that?
I believe it was 2014.
So it was pre-Trump era, which is interesting.
Yes.
Also, what was Mars Hill's relationship to politics like? Did Mark talk about politics much?
He talked about political issues some, like, you know, like he wouldn't, like abortion would occasionally be mentioned, certainly like homosexuality, you know, sex before marriage, like things like that, like the kind of the typical, like, you know, Christian sexual ethic would come up. But no, like he wouldn't specifically mention politicians or political parties or whatever. Like generally speaking, he did stay away from that. But he did kind of attack the culture, and so you knew where. I mean, he didn't need to say it in some sense, because like you know where he's going with this or what he's saying, but he didn't mention politicians or anything.
But his
like
motivation wasn't necessarily partisan. He actually cared about the issues that he was talking about more than which party would have agreed with them or not.
Right. I mean, I think that's right. I think that like he did actually think these were really important theological points to teach on, and so I don't think it was done necessarily, but it did. But the thing is that, you know, maybe he didn't explicitly want that, but he was getting rewarded for doing it. Mars Hill is getting rewarded for doing it because, again, like one of the ways to sell is to stand out. And in Seattle, standing out on those issues and taking the more hardline, like Orthodox Christian stance on them was rewarding. And so maybe he didn't like explicitly say, oh, or think, or even was aware that that's what I'm doing. But like, I think maybe like underneath like his motivations, like every time it's kind of like, you publish things to YouTube, like every time I talk about this topic, I get way more views and that kind of stuff. So I'm going to do more of that. And so it's just like this cycle, because yeah, I mean, you heard early on in the podcast that like a lot of his beliefs and things that he says how a church should be, he completely flipped on, right? Like if a church gets over a certain size, it becomes like apostates and that kind of thing. And so he completely flipped on a lot of these things because he was getting rewarded for doing that, and it becomes a little bit addictive. So I don't think it was for the purpose of influencing elections. It's certainly not kind of the Liberty University like Falwell type thing. It wasn't anything like that. It was more just like, hey, you're in Seattle. If you want to stand out, talk about these issues, right? And you'll get rewarded for it.
Don't you think that's just the Falwell stuff? Yeah, never. So this is what I would say. It never got to that level, but would it have? Because that's the thing. He flipped on all these issues, but like, is a participation in that spirit eventually lead to the Falwell thing?
Yeah. What if he had lasted until 2017 or 18 and during the Trump election? Because part of this, like I said earlier, another obvious thing lurking behind this is the parallels and contrasts between Driscoll and Trump, right? As the sort of heavy-driven, hyper-masculine leader, do-it person, right? And
I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I guess that's the thing. Like, it's possible to me. He does have a church still, and he's down in Arizona still preaching. But obviously now the incentives have changed because A, he had this experience, but then B, the local populace and the culture that he's trying to sell to is also very different. And so whether or not that escalation, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question.
Do you think? Go, Sam.
So we can't have this conversation and not talk about the sex stuff a little bit, because you were saying he was teaching kind of orthodox sexual ethics, and I think there are many interesting ways in which I'm not sure that's true.
Yeah, what I meant was like mainly on like the LGBT,
right.
Yeah, not on the like sex positivity like stuff. And I think that it's interesting. I agree with that. But again, that was a way to stand out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Be explicit, say it from the pulpit.
Because that was this is a weird thing, because he's like kind of, reactionary trad in some ways, right? Like the way to stand out in Seattle is, like emphasize big families and stuff like that. That was very countercultural. But then, the really strong emphasis on sex and marriage should be really great is not very a traditionally Christian emphasis, to say the least. And he talked explicitly from the pulpit about these things in a way that I think he is the most extreme example of that I know of by far.
I mean, John MacArthur wrote a review of his Song of Solomon series, and he titled the article "The Rape of Solomon's Song" because of how critical he was about how explicit Mark was being in the pulpit about these things. Very, very critical.
I mean, but how much of the criticism is just because these other guys just can't have as good a sex because they're beta males?
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest about that.
They need to be Chads. Yeah. No, I was talking to my wife about this last night. I think that it's hard. I'm still like thinking through this because she brought up a good point, and she just, after listening to the podcast series, kind of started thinking about this a little bit more. I think that one of the reasons that it's really dangerous, and maybe why Christians I don't think like any Christian pastor would be like, no, sex should not be great when you're married or anything else like that. They wouldn't say that. But then there's a question of like, why don't they preach on it more or emphasize that it should be and that kind of thing? And so my wife brought up a good point last night that she's just now thinking through, is that a lot of times like the directives that like he's giving about like, say, oral sex and that kind of stuff explicitly in the pulpit, that like, you should do this, you should whatever. The problem is that you are speaking to a crowd, not to an individual. And there's a lot of people that have like really bad experiences around some of these subjects from their past, and it's really dangerous to tell a woman who maybe has had problems that she should be doing these things, even if we can agree that that's the ideal, and like it would be ideal if whatever, she might not be ready for it. She might not ever be ready for it. It might not be good for her to do that. Her specifically, even if we say generally speaking, like this is fine or even good, like it might not be good for the individual to be told this. And so like my wife had some of those experiences. And so now she's just now kind of unpacking, like, what effect did this have on me? What effect did this have on our marriage? Me hearing some of these things and trying to like live up to them in some way, that in ways that I just wasn't ready for, and maybe I'll never be ready for. And so anyway, so that was just a thought about that specific thing that my wife brought up that I thought was a good point.
I think the ideal of what good marital sex is also an interesting topic, because on the one hand, is your marital sexual life supposed to be a pornographic fantasy, which some people think that that's the case, or is it on the other hand something that is not the ultimate in and of itself and actually points you to a higher spiritual reality, which is, from my reading of church history and historic Christianity, seems to be the case. It's that it is a passion along with hunger, but there are reasons why church practices lead you towards the ability to get beyond even needing that in your life and not having it. Not that it's not part of life and it's a necessary component of life, but just the emphasis on it as this ultimate thing that is equivalent to, a pornographic fantasy seems to have kind of been, I don't know, emphasized in the whole purity culture and all of that stuff too.
Right.
Like, it's okay,
Yeah,
whatever you want to do, it's fine. Just get married first. But it just doesn't.
Yeah. No, and that's Katie also grew up in like the Josh Harris time, and he very much was a part of that, and so it's amazing how influential that was. But I mean, Mark took that and dialed it up to 40, right? And just made it really, I mean, at least Joshua Harris wasn't that explicit about what he meant by those things. But anyway.
What's interesting, because I was in that culture too. I mean, I heard some of the Driscoll stuff that he said and things, but again, like that, the spirit was present, even if you didn't have a personality like Driscoll that just like would say jokes and things. Because I'm almost certain, I mean, Joshua Harris was, so CJ Mahaney started Sovereign Grace Ministries, and Joshua Harris was like his Timothy to the Paul, like CJ was the Paul. Joshua Harris took over for him, was the lead pastor at his big church in Gaithersburg, Maryland, that we called the Mothership. And I think CJ wrote a book also. I probably have it, on the Song of Psalms. I was just trying to think of the name, because it was, I mean, I didn't read Mark's book, I don't think, but that book was the same thing. Like we went through Song of Psalms quite a bit. It was just like, I will climb the tree, I will lay hold of its fruit. Like those verses, like we preach sermons on them,
Right.
And
it is interesting that the sex positivity thing did grow up kind of alongside when the internet was becoming really widely available. And so therefore porn became much, much more available. Like that is an interesting correlation, that like that's when that happened. That didn't happen in the 90s when internet was slow. Like that happened in the 2000s. And that's when it became like the popular message. To Sarah's point, like this is what we're doing, just talking about like making your marriage sex life a porn. And how much were they even aware that maybe that was influencing them?
Do you think that's what it was? It was like, this thing is happening. We need to set up like a capitalistic, competitive market. So like you're gonna have dream sex with your wife, and it's gonna be the best ever, and it isn't gonna be this flippant thing. It's not gonna be this like passing one night stand thing where you're just like the crumpled slutty rose. you know.
Because that story that Mark told, where there was the wife who attended church but the husband didn't, right? And then he basically encouraged the wife to tell the husband, I am going to do some oral sex for you right now because my pastor told me to. So, and then and then the husband starts showing up to church. Like whether or not that
Blowjobs for
story,
Jesus.
thank you, Luke. Whether or not that story is true, you can imagine that that pattern was actually probably representative of a lot of reasons why a lot of people actually were showing up for church. And I think, I mean, I'm going to try and keep this as brief. I think a weird thing is, like, I've been going through the church fathers and stuff like that on my YouTube channel. And like, I can't help but admit that virtually all of them are extremely sex negative. Like, they'll say things like, Christians should only have sex as much as a farmer should put seed in his soil to get the crop that he needs to harvest. And in the same
Well,
way
it's
that
very Augustinian too.
in the same
Yeah.
way that a farmer doesn't waste his seed to get to not get any more crop, take the metaphor to its logical conclusion that sex is bad, but you should only have as much sex as you need to have as many children as you need, right? Because sex draws you away from God. And even then, like in early Christianity, it was common for married couples, once they got past the childbearing age, to then suddenly have a celibate marriage, like where they were like a nun and a monk that were married to each other, right? So that then they could pursue greater holiness and abstinence, right? Like that was actually a common early Christian thing, and it sounds like super weird now, but that
even to go as far as leaving each other and going to monasteries in separate locations, I've read.
right, yeah, and they didn't get
Why would you have
divorced.
sex if you can't have kids?
Well, right, that was honestly the idea,
But
and
it
I
also
think
obviously was, it was obviously, influenced by especially early on, the heavy influence that Plato and kind of
yeah,
Gnostics were having, where like your body is kind of like the lower form of and so like a lot of your appetites and that kind of stuff, like you should deny them, like they're bad. This world is bad, the material world is bad, your body is in some sense bad, and we need to reach the spiritual plane. And so I think that a lot of that was also like kind of this Platonic influence, which was growing at the time.
but how is it that it's not that much different than fasting, right?
No.
And this is another interesting thing, that like that Protestants, so I mean, as far as I know, the first like sex positive Christian was Martin Luther, really, like Martin Luther, was a monk, started Protestant Reformation, got married, and then he would talk about how much he enjoyed his marital relations with his wife, right? And he was perfectly happy. He was Driscoll-esque in his own way in the 1520s and 1530s.
No, it's yeah.
And that is a big fork that I feel like Protestantism really invented in Christian history, as far as I can tell, was that instead of the sexual ideal for Christians being celibacy, that there was an exception for marriage and procreation as something that was not, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't the ideal itself, right? And then Protestantism says, no, we're going to take that celibacy thing off of the pedestal and put married couples having children with good sexual relations at the top. That was actually, I think, one of the biggest changes. I mean, Protestantism had a lot of different changes, but that was a big change. And I think that it's important to say that.
Yes, and I think you can, so for Protestants, and I mean this, you can, as a Protestant, because you can just, go back to the Bible, you can take that early church stuff and you can explain it away, because you can just say like that's where they were just wrong, and because of Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But as someone who's historically rooted Christian tradition that has this continuance thing, you can't really do that, which is probably why, I mean, even within, it's funny, I don't know, what you see and hear depends a lot on where you're standing and the kind of person you are. So as I've moved into Orthodoxy, like I've probably moved towards that, like even, because Orthodoxy is probably, even though they don't carry it quite the same way that Catholics do, they're very much along those lines of natural family planning, sex is for procreation. I mean, they wouldn't take it's just much more in continuance with this kind of stuff. I mean, I think that's kind of standard practice.
And so I think that an interesting thing, right? Like, so Protestantism takes that stance. And then during like the Jesus movement of the 60s and 70s, there was an even greater degree of sex positivity in the Christianity of the Jesus movement because, you know, hippies, right? And it's the 60s. And then I feel like, because basically what suburban megachurches are, they're Jesus movement baby boomers. The Jesus movement was for hippies that didn't have kids or responsibilities, but then they grow up, they get married, they have kids, they get a job, they move to the suburbs, and now they need a church for their family and their kids. And that's basically what megachurches are, right? That's when they show up, is when baby boomers start having the millennial children, which is us, right? And then so it's like, man, what are we going to teach our kids about sex? And it's like, okay, well, we don't want them to have sex before they're married. How do we get them to do this in this, you know, post-sexual revolution age? Is we say, we hold up, man, there is great sex at the end of the tunnel. You just need to get to the light at the end of the tunnel, right? Man, if you wait till your wedding night, whoo, baby, it's going to be fantastic. And it'll be so much better than these kids who are like tape that's lost their stickiness because they've stuck and unstuck from too many people.
When you
right?
said,
Like you guys have heard these analogies too. I'm not making
Sarah,
this
were
up.
you the one that brought that up? That someone told you that?
I think I brought.
Oh, did you? Okay.
I was talking.
Oh,
I brought up the wilted rose, like the analogy that was passed around in youth groups, where they would pass around a white rose and have everyone touch it, and then at the end they would say, "Do you want to be like this?" You know, just disgusting.
Ooh, yeah, right. And that was the idea, right? Like that's what American evangelical purity culture was stay pure until you're married, and then once you're married, have at it, right? And that was sort of the, I don't know, the marketing pitch. And it's had a lot of problems, and like I didn't realize how different that was from most of Christian history until I started looking into it. And I feel like Mars Hill is like that to its absolute maximized extreme.
Even if you said you were going to be biblical in holding up marital sex as the ideal versus celibacy, I mean, Christ himself was not married. I don't see how you could do that, even if you're just looking at the Bible.
That's because he had to be for his mission, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, even Paul, when he talks about like married couples, like, you know, kind of fasting from sex in a way, and like, you know, going away for a period of prayer, but don't do it too long. But his reasoning was, don't do it too long because you might be tempted for an even like to sin in some other way. And so like, yeah, so it wasn't like he wasn't making the argument come back together because this is an inherent good and you shouldn't abstain for it for very long. More like you need to come back because there's really a lot of danger in abstaining for too long as well. So now it was a different argument than obviously what Mars Hill or the sex positivity folks were saying.
So it's essentially, well, interestingly, I don't know if we want to go here, but it's a concession for weakness, right? Like you haven't conquered your passions, so you should come back together so that you're not burning with lust, you're not burning with desire. But then I've also, so I don't know if we want to go here, but I don't know if they ever talked about divorce, but Piper, I used to listen to Piper sermons on divorce, man, and I'm a zealot, and so I loved it because he's just like not into divorce at all and giving any concessions for it. Because Piper would essentially make those exact same arguments of, and I mean, that's kind of what Paul says too, is like Moses allowed for a certificate of divorce because of your like.
Well, Jesus said that.
Of your hearts.
Right, right. But about this, right. Because of your hardness of heart. And he's like, that's not a glowing endorsement for divorce. Right. He's just like saying you have a hard heart, and so fine, I'll let you do it. Yeah. I think all of this can be what's hard. I don't know. I would probably go back to the consumeristic, capitalistic propaganda piece that I think we're just swimming in the waters of, and fish that don't even know they're wet, because that's just the world we live in now. And I think the problem with like this infinite growth stuff, whatever. I'm going to plug technological babble because I see it everywhere. I think that's what's going on. And anytime you move away from like, the reason small churches, I would argue, are better is because it has to do with like economies of scale. And in small scale communities, like sub Dunbar number stuff, you know people in like the fullest sense of the word, and you're not relying on shorthands that are taking the place of like a depth of relationship. And I think, I don't know, you can turn evangelism or the gospel. Oh God, I used to like, that was Sovereign Grace's big thing. It's just like, is this gospel centered? Is where you're saying is gospel centered? Is this cross centered? And like, I saw some meme once that was just about like gospeliciousness, because it was just like everything was just gospel. I'm like, what do you even say that? Like, I would go to small groups and people would just be like, you got to be sure to preach the gospel. And I'm just like, what are you saying? What does that even mean?
Mhm.
And it really comes down to just like this little shorthanded creedal story about Jesus and atonement and whatever.
Yeah, I still don't know what that means. I also don't know what it means when people say biblical. I don't know what that means.
Well, I know where to point you to find out. Should we talk about the charismatic stuff a little bit before we need to wrap up? Because I thought that was another interesting piece that kind of fit.
Yeah, you have a charismatic background, right, Sam?
The left isn't even quite the right word, but yes, I grew up in a charismatic church, and I still consider myself charismatic mostly. But it wasn't like that. And so I was honestly, I didn't know any of you Calvinists even know what the Holy Spirit is, honestly. So, but it was interesting that Driscoll talked a lot about visions, right? And guidance from God and intuitions, and even like, like almost like woman at the well sort of insights into the various sexual misbehaviors of people in his church and stuff like that. And I feel like my church didn't have like a strong charismatic leader in both senses of the word, who used that as spiritual authority for like, look, I've got a closer connection to God than you do. And what are you going to do? Are you going to contradict me because I'm getting this from God, sort of thing? And that gave me a lot of the heebie-jeebies.
But try doing it the other way, right? If you say like one of his elders had a prophetic vision about some of Mark's sin or something that needs to happen, was he going to accept that? No, because God talks to Mark.
Yes.
It's not, it was a less broad. See, that was the thing. Like it was a little bit charismatic, but it was really kind of the locus of all the charismatic powers was in Mark Driscoll. It wasn't in the body of the church, unless the body of the church was agreeing with what Mark already thought anyway. Interesting. Right?
Well, like, he wasn't he wasn't encouraging other people to engage in charismatic practice.
No, and I mean, try it. Try it if that lawyer had said, "Listen, I got a vision that if we change these bylaws, this would be wrong." Like he still gets steamrolled. Like that doesn't work. So
there's all of it was interpreted through the elders. So like even at Sovereign Grace, the churches that I used to go to, they believe in the gift of prophecy, but they would distinguish between like old school prophecy, right, where like, if you don't say the right thing, you get killed.
Right.
And like current prophecy, like they put in these caveats.
Well, that same thing, exact same thing that I grew up with.
Yeah.
Exact same thing.
We had a prophecy mic. So like during the hour and a half worship service, where we're all singing and flying flags and doing whatever we were doing, cartwheels. There was a prophecy mic, so people could go up if they had a word to speak at the prophecy mic, but you didn't just go up and talk in the mic. You went up and you talked to the elder who was standing right next to the mic, and they filtered it because we have to make sure it's biblical, because we're all
an open mic is a really dangerous thing.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what people say?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's all like checked and filtered, and that gets back at this kind of like implicit control thing and from authority. And so like they'll be like, yes, it's gifts of the Spirit. Yes, it's whatever, but always filtered through the authority and the person and the interpretation of the elder. And like, that's not all, I don't know. I mean, that's not all bad.
Well, but it still stops at that. To me, it's like you can have all that set up. But where does the authority go when there are divisions within the authority in a single church body? And that's where I keep going back to more historic Christianity, because I can't see a way around that. I mean, it's gonna break apart. Maybe not in your generation, but your kids' generation. I don't see how that lasts more than couple generations.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I mean, that's a big argument. That's one of the things I remember Father Josiah Trinum, like I remember he said that once because he's a convert to Orthodoxy. And I remember he said that at one point, one of his big reasons for him converting was just like, he's like, my kids won't have a church anymore. Like when they grow up, the church won't exist that they're in. And it might, like, you might be in certain situations where it might, like my wife's small town, rural Lutheran church, like it's getting borderline, like it may still exist when those kids go there and the next generation, maybe grandkids, but there's a reason for that. It's not because of the church and the structure in and of itself. It's because of the built-in limitations that I said again, like you can't, it's scale. It's the economies of scale thing. The kind of consumeristic, capitalistic, propagandistic stuff doesn't play there as much because it can't, because there's not options. And the community is built in where like all these people know each other, and like that church, like not going to that church has so many other things playing into it that like they just, it's not viable.
I think that there's so many ways in which this pattern is playing out that the last couple American generations wanted to give their kids more freedom and more choices than they had, right? So they're like, their goal wasn't to give their kids the one church that they were going to definitely be in. They wanted to be like, oh, well, of course, I want you to be able to choose for yourself, right? That the gift that I want to pass on to the next generation is freedom of choice. And like, iterate that a couple times, and now it's like, oh my goodness, there's so many choices, it's existentially terrifying, right? And like, how do I choose? How do I know what I want? I don't, and there's some part of it that's like, at some point, I don't want to be able to choose. I want to be told what I'm doing.
That's
Right.
like my experience exactly. That's my favorite thing about Orthodoxy. Like even when I started going there, I was just like, this is overwhelming. I don't know a ton of stuff. It's uncomfortable. But I said, but I don't, like, there's nothing, my opinions
Doesn't matter.
are irrelevant. And so I was just like, and that's so awesome.
And he makes up for it by getting on these calls with us.
Huh?
And you make up for it by getting on these calls with us.
Maybe.
No, I think you're right. I mean, there's even like marketing and psychological research that when people have too many options on like a menu at a restaurant, they're less happy with their choice.
For sure.
Like even if like objectively their choice is if you just did like a blind taste test or something with a smaller menu, but the sheer size of the menu like makes you constantly second guess or wonder what else could I have had instead of this. Right? Yeah, exactly.
That's dating apps, right? Same problem.
Right.
Yeah.
It's true on so many levels. The online dating, there's food choices when you go into Costco. I mean, et cetera, on down the list. It's just
the Trader Joe's model is the opposite of that. That's one of the big reasons Trader Joe's works. And somebody was telling me this today, and I had never thought about it. But like, you go to Trader Joe's, you go to a regular grocery store, and you're looking for black beans. There's like 12 versions. You go to Trader Joe's, there's one can of black beans. There's one type. So like when you go to the grocery shop, it's just like they've made all the decisions for you. And it's stuff that, is a certain quality and that you like. And so it's really freeing. Like it's that. Like going to Trader Joe's is easy.
Yeah, there's benefit in thinking having that pre-curated for you, so you just don't have to do all the mental work for it. And obviously having the curation happen over thousands of years by many people across many countries, many geographies, many cultures, many movements and wars and all that kind of stuff, like that curation can be really powerful in like saying, no, we're going to distill this down into something very simple for you to participate in. So I get why those older traditions maybe are starting to appeal now to people.
It still feels difficult though, because I've talked about this with my husband too. It's like, well, we still have the choice. It's not like we live in a place where if we decide to attend the Orthodox Church, we're driving an hour. There's a Catholic church
you could leave
right down the road. There's a million choices that are much closer. We're not limited, so that's still, it's hard to figure out what the right decision is in that, in that instance, because we are still ultimately deciding. But I guess what we keep going back to is that since we do have these options, we do have to choose what is it that we're choosing to submit ourselves to. And if we do choose to submit to that thing, we want it to be something that has that longevity, that depth, that history behind it.
And not a guy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. Or a set of 5 guys who are currently in charge.
Right. And part of my solution to this problem is I'm going to like the closest Bible church to my house, and that no one's name is on the marketing bulletin, and it predates my grandparents, so at least hopefully it could outdate my grandchildren, right? And I'm going to that one. Why? Because it's the closest one, right? And man, do I disagree with it theologically, but I'm going and I'm biting the bullet, and this is the best that I can do with the paradox of abundance of choice that I can manage right now.
But I think that's a great choice. Like, that's what I honestly think, people are going to do whatever they want. So like whatever I think is irrelevant, but I've often said that, like, even with my beef or Charlie's beef with me, I'll correct that, but not my beef with Charlie. There was, because that's his thing. He's just like, you're just this evangelist for orthodoxy. I'm like, no, I'm not. I just talk about my experience and what I like about it. But like what you do, like what you just described doing, perfect. I think that's basically what everyone should do, because again, it's about true community and knowing people and Dunbar numbers. So like when you just pick the closest church to you and go there, and you could, I almost wish everyone would do that. And part of me wishes that I could do that too. It's just like, and I thought about it actually. There's like this little Lutheran church that's dying. So like they rent it out to other people. We're like, it's on the next block, like the next street over. So I'm a block away. My church is the church that we go to. There's this little Annunciation Chapel that's across the street also. But and we thought when we were like making the move to Orthodoxy, like when I went to my last kind of Protestant church, I was thinking like, well, we could maybe just go to that church, and it would just be local things and this old. But part of my problem was I just had so many, like I was basically trained in this tradition of the young, restless, and reformed camps, like a Driscoll type church. And so like that was, like, what is that? It's not a denomination. Like it has no real like historical roots, although you can trace back some of its lineage through different things, and it may not last. So like I often call myself an evangelical mutt. Like I grew up in a heck's the denomination? Now I'm blanking on it. Whatever. But I've gone to just like all these different church denominations growing up throughout my life. And so then it's just like, so then you think, like, what am I? Like, what is my tradition? I don't have one. It's just like this nebulous, amorphous, non-denominational evangelical thing. And so like, what does fidelity to that mean?
Right.
Same exact way too.
I don't know. And also if I tried to stay faithful to like a young, restless Reformed church, I would lose my mind. Like my wife, that's actually why we left, is my wife was just like, we have to go. Like, you're so miserable and upset all the time. Like it's affecting our family. Like it's destroying our family life because you're so upset about this stuff all the time. Because talking to a young, restless Reformed person about theology is like torture.
That little short episode, I don't know if you all have listened to it. It was like a 15-minute bonus episode in the Mars Hill podcast. And he talks about liturgy and the shaping effects that it has. And I think that's not an unimportant consideration as well. I mean, if you're attending a church that is shaping you in one way, and it's not to be more like Christ, that's a big deal. It really is a big deal. So I think that's where you could shoot holes in the idea of just going to the church that's closest to you. I don't know. I mean, these are things we're still wrestling with. So
All right.
again,
I do go to the second closest church to me because the first closest one I do not trust.
No. I'm excited. The church that I will be going to in Charleston, or at least starting, trying out, is within walking distance. Like it's only a few blocks away, and so we're just gonna try that. I think it's the oldest congregation south of Virginia, which is cool too. But there's a really good article that I think you guys will like. I'll send it to you. It's called "What the Hijabi Saw." And it's about this. He's a Reformed pastor who was going to a Church of England service, just visiting, and they were having a choir service. It was some kind of festival or feast or something, and so he's just going there because of the liturgy and the choir and all that kind of stuff. And so, but there was this girl who was sitting in the pews who was wearing a hijab. So clearly from a Muslim background, or is currently a Muslim or whatever. And so but she's sitting in this Church of England service. And this guy was pretty critical of the Church of England because they're, he considers them like very liberal and that kind of stuff. And the preaching that he's not going to agree with. But then he wrote this article saying, okay, but what did she see? Like, even if ignore the sermon, what did she actually experience? And he just walks through the beauty of the liturgy of sin and forgiveness and repentance, and read 2 Bibles, recited the creeds, like all that kind of stuff. And he's like, so even ignore the sermon, like even if you don't agree with the sermon, like she saw the gospel acted out in a certain way in front of her, even though like a lot, maybe even the priest doesn't even believe that. Like she still saw it because of the liturgy. I thought it was a really good article. I'll send it to you guys.
Mm-hmm.
I already like it.
And so people might wonder, like, what does this all have to do with Mars Hill at this point? And good question. But I think that the answer is something like this is sort of the legacy of people who grew up some way looking towards it or related to it in some way or another. Obviously, Tripp, like super directly related, but like part of the reason why the podcast is popular is because it's like the most extreme archetypal example of a pattern that a lot of people have experienced.
Yep.
Right. And like, okay, I never went to that church, but like, man, I can listen to the podcast and I get all sorts of weird, reminiscent heebie-jeebies because of all the things that are similar to things that I've seen. Right. And it's interesting that it almost seems like it was the end of a train of thought that crashed and didn't have anywhere else left to go, and that the only choice is to do some serious backing up and reconsidering after it. And all of us seem to be in various similar but divergent ways wrestling with that same question.
Yep, I think it's exactly right.
And that goes, I mean, you were talking about Trumpism and Americanism and all of that. I think it's just going along with all of these things that are crashing in society too. I mean, it's the end of, in a lot of ways, it's the end of the consumerist project. And in whatever ways the church tried to jump on that train, it's all coming off the rails, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there's going to be more train crashes coming. I think
for sure.
Some of these mega churches will go out with a whimper, some will go out with a bang, some will go out with something in between, but they're just tearing each other apart. like at
Well,
least
not
the
just mega
Chicago
churches.
ones. Yeah.
Not just mega churches, think like mega denominations, think the Southern Baptist Convention. Like
Yeah.
I can't imagine them staying together. I think that
Mhm.
that's going to be a split at some point, and that's the largest Protestant denomination
Yeah.
in the
Charlie, our
world.
favorite Southern Baptist pastor, took his church out of the denomination already.
Did they? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Does anyone have some closing thoughts? We should probably wrap this up.
No.
Really, Luke? That's the first time I've ever heard you give that answer to an open opportunity to talk.
Jesus saves.
But what does that even mean, Luke? I don't even know what you mean when you say that.
Is that gospel centered?
Super gospel centered.
Yeah. Well, no, I appreciate you guys jumping on the call. It was great to get the band back together and chat a little bit more. This was fun.
This was fun. Yeah. All right. I'll turn off the recording.